Commander Boreal, enemy forces in our perimeter.
Where?
Southern Quadrant, but they were on the move. Current location unknown.
There is no time to be lost. Battle, brothers!
You know, there are a lot of genres on life support nowadays. Horror is dominated by copy and pasted asset flips and jump scares galore. Shooters have to pick between being mega Twitch reaction fests or throwback boomer shooter number 9826. There hasn't been a stealth game made since the year 2006. But I think strategy has had it about as rough as all of them, while simultaneously having caused basically all of our problems ever. The ever-present focus on esports and competitive gameplay, Blizzard's StarCraft as well as Dota having spawned the MOBA genre certainly comes to mind.
I'm trolling, sorry.
Most games now just want to be that, a StarCraft clone with multiplayer. They pay little if any attention to any unique aesthetics or mechanics in their games. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, there were plenty of games which broke that mold, and which did it at the behest of a soulless, money-grubbing corporation no less. A carrion lord for whom 100 underrepresented faction codexes are sacrificed every day so that it may never truly die. In the grim dark future of 2004, there was no peace amongst the stars. Instead, there was something about Dawn of War. I personally don't think that there's any better introduction to the grim dark future of the 41st millennium than Dawn of War, except maybe Space Marine. If you start with the books, then you'll have this very particular view of the setting and aesthetic, while not actually recognizing the objects or ideas that need to be visualized first, before you can actually understand them. Not to mention that the quality of the novels varies wildly based on the writer in question. As I type this, I've been reading through the Commissar Yarrick Omnibus thing, and having just come off the back of the first trilogy of Cyphus Cain novels, I'm kinda shocked at just a terrible drop in quality between the two. Likewise, if you start with the tabletop manuals and models, then you'll be biased towards the mechanical functions of the universe, and also you'll be completely destitute. But if you start with Dawn of War, then you get the full picture, albeit one whose accuracy is kinda questionable. You get a good introduction to the general feeling of the setting, the way it looks and sounds. You get an introduction briefly to some of the main factions, you see what both the tabletop and the writings depict in a much more lively fashion, and of course, you get to play one of the best strategy games ever made. Warhammer has a very long history, and I'm not going to explain it. There's plenty of other people who undertake that task in a much more professional manner than myself. I will, however, give you the cliff notes. It is the 41st millennium, aka the year 40,000. Humanity is locked in a constant, endless struggle against literally everything else in the galaxy, from space elves to demons to the Egyptians, or even worse, the British. Our only hope is to shed blood on an outright unimaginable scale by turning every human being into a cog in the endless machine that is the Imperium. Sometimes we win, usually we don't, though if we do, it's probably because of the guys from the box art, the
Space Marines, today the enemy is at our door.
Warhammer games had always been around. They were actually pretty ahead of their time in that, but they've always struggled with making them truly work compared to their contemporaries. If they were just able to harness the unique aspects of the Warhammer universe into something that truly represented it, they could make a game that not only was excellent to play and which satisfied their fans, but which also attracted new fans interested in the setting. But that was always their mistake. Games Workshop, the owner of Warhammer and its IPs, have always worked towards one goal, the selling of overpriced plastic miniatures. Everything they would do, and everything they still do, is in service to that cause. But it's a bad idea. Warhammer as a tabletop hobby, while popular by tabletop standards, is not exactly easy to get into, or worse, easy to play with anyone else. Warhammer now is popular because of the online community of admirers which enjoy it rather than because they're all diehard fans of racing to their local game store to pick up the newest Primaris release. Warhammer games for a long time held to this idea. Yes, the original Space Hulk games were pretty good renditions of the universe for their time, but it was still made to get you into the Warhammer hobby, or to sell it to people who already liked it. This is where Dawn of War comes in, because unlike other Warhammer games, it sought to do something really important. It wanted to stand on its own. It did not want to be a Warhammer game. It wanted to be a game about Warhammer, and so that's what they did. Dawn of War is perhaps the greatest refutation of the Blizzard or CNC style strategy that there ever was. Ironic given that Dawn of War would fall apart courtesy of trying to rip off Blizzard, who had themselves sorta kinda plagiarized Warhammer, but that's a very complicated story for another day. Other strategy games were happy to play as much like a game as possible while retaining their more general strategic elements. For example, StarCraft was perfectly content to depict itself as a game where the units were introduced simply for their gameplay role, with little in the way of thematic, narrative, or aesthetic intrigue, something that Dawn of War could easily have followed. One could imagine a scenario where they're playing the alternate Dawn of War, where you deploy an individual Marine, an individual Banshee, or an individual Orc Nob, and there wouldn't be anything unfair about making your game that way. It's a sound way of designing something. But is it interesting? Is it evocative enough? Does it communicate what that unit is actually supposed to be? No, it really doesn't. It lacks several things. It lacks scale. It lacks a connection between other units. It limits that unit's expressive abilities both in combat and out of it. It means that gameplay focuses entirely on the idea of grouping individuals together, which makes it feel extremely gamey and unengaging. Commanding one Space Marine at a time would just be silly and weird, unless they were supposed to be some badass who didn't need anyone else. What's worse is if you took the game's setting super seriously, would it make sense for a military to deploy individuals like that? Would it make sense for them to be effective in combat against opponents if there was just one of them? It gives up the ghost that you're playing a game, that you're commanding little sprites or models as opposed to people, no matter how funny their selection and order quotes might be. Relic denied this idea for essentially all the reasons I stated before, and more. It just wouldn't work with 40k. Instead, they went with a far less common form of unit organization, the squad system, and to this day, Relic's early iterations of it is probably the best implementation you could ever get, if we're not counting Men of War at least. Units don't deploy as individuals, they deploy as squads of varying sizes, squads which include multiple individual models, each of whom contribute a portion of that unit's health and damage. A squad doesn't die when it loses health, instead each model in the unit has its own unique health pool, and will die when it runs out, lowering the overall effectiveness of the entire squad. Alright, you might say, what's the big whoop? Squads are slightly more complicated, what's the big deal? The big deal is that the squads are so much more effective at enabling strategy compared to exclusively only having those individual units. The squad is the foundation for what makes the game feel so good to play, as well as what enamors you with the setting itself. Think back to that example. If you knew a Space Marine was a big deal, but you only deployed them in sets of one, if you wanted to retain their strength in terms of their depiction, how would you balance that out against other factions? Dawn of War did it by using the squad system, among other things. To communicate the relative power of units by not knowing their resource cost, or even knowing anything about their lore or setting, but by showing you how big or how many of them there are. A squad of Marines can have, at most, 8 Marines and a Sergeant, alongside a Skull Probe or some Apothecary for healing, the last two providing only a supportive role. Compare them to a squad of Guardsmen who have far more troops in them, alongside a Sergeant and an attached commander, and you can see how useful this becomes. Each individual squad or unit can vary in size depending on strength. If a squad only allows 4 people into it, then that should tell you that they are dangerous indeed. It also makes them vulnerable. A squad of Guardsmen is initially weak. They can afford to lose troops to the point where commissars can execute one of them to buff the rest of the squad. They're not susceptible to attacks which deal high damage to a single model. But a tactical squad or pariahs? Or how about a squad of Grey Knights? In this way, the squad system also presents unique ways to engage your opponents. Clever players will use abilities or attacks which can target individual strong models in a unit, while saving splash damage for melee or foes who are easy to defeat. What's even more interesting is that units don't start at full strength. Remember the Space Marine problem? One Space Marine would narratively be too strong to feasibly match against a single Guardian or a single Orc. That's why the squad system deploys them different. At base, a squad Marine starts with 4 Marines, and they require more than the entire cost of their squad to reach their maximum, not counting their extra equipment. But wait, there's even more. If each model in a squad is his or her own unique entity on the battlefield, then that means that their attacks can also be modified. Thus, the squad system allows you to outfit each unit with their own unique weapons, or a pool of weapons which radically alter the function of the squad. Some squads can be equipped with flamers to burn infantry and break their morale, or you could give them plasma weapons to punch through armor of heavy infantry. These add-ons vary from unit to unit, and the factions, obviously, but what's important is that it grants more options to a player in terms of unit composition, as well as resource management, since extra weapons cost extra resources. Adding weapons like this is an aspect taken straight from the tabletop also, which kind of makes it more codex compliant, if you will. The closer the game can get to depicting its source material like that, the better. Vehicles in single entity units then take on a unique role compared to infantry, since there's only one of them when you produce the unit. Vehicles aren't just bigger units that get produced at a different building. They're wholly different in their mechanical function. They're armored, and they require particular weapons to defeat. They often sport multiple weapons which fire independently of each other, and which can sometimes be customized just like the infantry. Single entity commanders or monsters have unique powers relevant to their function. The most exciting being the giant monsters and super weapons of each faction, like the Avatar of Cain for the Eldar, or the Bloodthirster for the Ruinous Powers. They're unique also because their contextual application as vehicles can preclude them from certain abilities or functions, like benefiting from cover, or more importantly, engaging in melee combat. Melee is a unique element of Dawn of War that other games of its era never knew how to handle outside of its most basic implementation. Melee combat in other games is combat of any other variety, you just have to get closer. Play StarCraft for example, you'll notice that any melee unit in that game fights that way by just getting close. The actual mechanical act ends at closing the distance. Melee in Dawn of War, though, is more complicated, again, just like it is in the lore and tabletop counterparts. Now, we must quickly address something. Yes, it is silly that melee exists in Warhammer, everyone has guns, but sometimes they intentionally forgo them for the fucking chainsaw sword. It's just cool. It's just meant to be cool and fun, so don't worry about it. That being said, in the world of Warhammer, some people are better at melee than others. If we were betting on who would win in a fight between a guardsman and his bayonet versus a kill-a-can, my bet's on the can. And that, of course, is the point. Melee being its own form of combat gives it a greater degree of power compared to more basic strategy games. Melee units are devastating because they engage in a form of combat where they hold a unit in place and limits their ability to actually fight. Some units favor range and then lose terribly in melee. Some favor melee and have to use every advantage they have to close the distance before they're shot down. It means that the best armies want to have a mix of melee and range, both in terms of infantry and vehicles. But that's hard because having a diverse army takes time and resources, as well as being heavily dependent on what faction you're actually playing. Dawn of War has one of the best faction rosters for any strategy game, with the base game having 4, but with all the expansions adding an additional 5, all of whom play radically different from each other except maybe Chaos. The developers had to split the difference between staying accurate to the tabletop while making an engaging and fairly balanced game comprising of so many unique armies. This sort of balancing is very difficult, and different games have different solutions to the problem. StarCraft decided to make most factions relatively homogeneous. While they do play different from each other, their differences are less pronounced since they're still capable of similar things. Factions include a healthy mix of units which interact with each other in mostly the same ways. Age of Empires gave every civilization the same basic roster and building options, and then tweaked them along with unique bonuses and units for each one. Total War went about it by making a mix of unique rosters and generic ones which were applied to factions based on their cultures and backgrounds. Dawn of War is special though because Warhammer is special. No army plays the same, and sometimes that diversity in playstyle is present even within a faction itself. What's better, the factions themselves don't fall into any generic classification for a faction from another strategy game. For example, there is no faction which is overtly geared towards being the early game faction, or the late game faction. Instead, they're depicted as being wholly devoted to the aesthetic and feeling of what they're like in the setting. The Space Marines are exemplary in this regard. The Adeptus Astartes are bioengineered super warriors. They know no fear. Each one is a devastating tool of battle, which makes them particularly deadly as individual combatants compared to other factions. A single Marine squad is capable of taking on most enemy infantry in the game, and even some vehicles given the right equipment. Space Marines have an emphasis on their heavy infantry, who are capable of using a wide variety of weapons and tactics. They're excellent in both melee and at range, and have really good commander units. They're remarkably mobile as well, being able to deploy via drop pods alongside some vehicles. They are, however, very resource intensive. Fully outfitting a squad is expensive. Additionally, their vehicle pool is somewhat lackluster. Their dreadnoughts, big robots meant for melee, are excellent tanky units, but their other options aren't so effective. The Marines themselves are also vulnerable to more specialized units. They can put up a good fight against anything, but if they try fighting specialized melee or ranged units, they'll begin to struggle, and they'll likely do so at a resource deficit. Their late game relic units are reasonably effective, but they lean much more into the role of being tanky and drawing fire as opposed to doing lots of damage. They also lack anything regarding effective artillery outside of one unit. For a faction that's the complete opposite of the Space Marines, you have the Orks. The Orks have a wide array of units of all types, from melee or ranged chaff to larger, stronger variants of those same units. They have ramshackle vehicles that can trade well with their opponents, and a good mix of crowd control. They require more setup compared to other factions, since they have a unique population mechanic which governs how many Orks you can field. At their height, you can swarm over your enemy in a great green tide, using your diverse set of units to spread out your damage amongst multiple types and ranges. They're also just ludicrous, as they should be given that they're orcs. They do, however, need time to get rolling, and they're not as mobile as other factions. Their bases are uniquely difficult to destroy because almost all of them are equipped with machine guns to defend themselves against enemy units. And since they need to build WA banners to increase their population cap, you'll have a hard time breaking into their bases without casualties. They have a clear emphasis on melee though, with even the most basic orc boys being above average in combat. They don't have that much health however, and can be gunned down quickly given you have enough firepower. They're obviously not that subtle, a real smash and grab kind of army, and an excellent depiction of their tabletop counterpart. If you did want to play a faction that required a little more finesse, you'd play Eldar. For the uninitiated, the Eldar are space elves, thus making them horrifically insufferable. In-game, however, they have a solid mixture of specialist units with highly mobile vehicles, as well as very effective commanders and spellcasters. Their units are excellent at their particular role, from the melee-focused Banshees to the ranged Dark Reavers, but take them outside their niche and they'll instantly begin to struggle. In the hands of a good player, they can be deadly, but they require some serious micro to work effectively, and they can be overwhelmed by numbers if they aren't careful. They do, however, have the Avatar of Cain, a powerful super unit classified as a demon, which makes it incredibly difficult to damage, but can easily destroy nearly any unit it engages. If you want more monsters and demons, you can play the Forces of Chaos, madmen who worship the dark gods of the Immaterium. They share some aspects with the Space Marines, namely some vehicles, and the obvious traitor Chaos Space Marines, who are slightly weaker, less versatile, but they're still effective. Their main boons are their powerful melee units and demons, who could tear through opponents lightning fast. They also have good commander units, and to top it all off, they don't get just one giant demon, but two of them. Perhaps you're not so keen on more Marines though, in which case you might like my favorite faction, the Imperial Guard. Comprised of average humans pressed into service, they have massed infantry led by powerful officers and supported by the best vehicles in the game. There's just so much variety, so much character, which is one of the reasons why people are drawn to Warhammer. They're memorable and yet interesting to explore both as narrative elements as well as gameplay implements. There's at least one faction that will appeal to you, and not just because of how they play. The character of Dawn of War is what's truly important. Depicting the grimdark future of the 41st millennium has always been a challenge, since it combines a massive scale with complicated and varied imagery. Dawn of War, being an older game, has its own cartoony style, yet it maintains its grim aesthetic perfectly. Most unit models are excellent depictions of their tabletop counterparts, with little details like extra effects on different weapons, unique animations for nearly every unit. There's variation in the models present in a squad, plenty of other things. The violence and gore in particular is memorable, though of course rather basic given the age of the game. Combat doesn't just kill units, often they get destroyed or immolated. In melee combat, different units have animations for finishing their foes off, while others use their sweeping blows to send smaller models flying across the battlefield. You can enable persistent corpses, making sure that dead bodies never despawn so you can see the scale of the carnage you leave behind. That's why Dawn of War is so memorable, so much more engaging as a strategy experience as well as a Warhammer. It cares about the aesthetic experience of the game just as much as the strategic elements. I think that the strategy genre in particular is susceptible to being stonewalled when it comes to discussions of merit, especially since they're so formative for so many people who played them back in the day. But frankly, there's very little to say about many strategy games in terms of how it feels to play them. Dawn of War was made in a time, however, where the aesthetic experience was just as important as the mechanical, and furthermore, only accomplished that through the arduous and attentive depiction of the 40k universe, which itself has grappled with that same question for years. Warhammer, I think, figured it out, that you could be interesting on multiple levels while retaining a competitive edge, while retaining the complexity of the strategic experience. It manifests in many forms, but the most pronounced is the act of painting your miniatures. On the tabletop, when you buy your models, they come as little gray kits with no color, and there's a very good reason for that. The models are intended for particular factions and sub-factions, but were also meant to allow the player to customize them to their heart's content. It's extremely common for someone to make up their own Space Marine chapters, guard regiments, chaos war bands, and the like, just as they are to paint a company of Blood Angels or Cadian shock troops. If you want to play tabletop, you kinda have to learn to paint, and not just paint something simple either, it's the details. And it's hard. You need to pay attention to every stroke, every touch of color and depth. You gotta water your paints, man. And it's in service to rolling dice on a table to see whose sociopaths win in a chainsaw fight. It shouldn't surprise you then that Dawn of War also includes an army painter. The most important aesthetic flourish, both narratively and mechanically for Warhammer, is produced in as reasonable of a manner as they could. It shows how important the little things are in the game. that the strategy elements are balanced with the brilliant art direction of the 41st Millennium, to create a game that meets all expectations at all times and which engrosses you in a universe you may or may not have been privy to. Dawn of War was my proper introduction into Warhammer, outside of TTS and the demo for Space Marine. Its character and its love for the setting enamored me with it long before the series hit critical mass like it has now. But I think what truly makes Dawn of War exceptional is that this idea of being the gateway into the wider world of Warhammer is one I shared with many, many people. So much so that out of all the various 40k products and media, it was Relic's games which have impacted it the most. In part, it's because they just made good games, even if I just can't stomach the gameplay of the sequel, but also because their depiction of Warhammer was the perfect amalgam of the spirit of nonsense that Warhammer started with, alongside the grimdark doomerism of the far future, which is what it's known for now. And I can prove this effect was widespread, because of how the community uses Dawn of War compared to everything else. They use it for the memes.
Yes, this is Commander Boreal.
Steady yourself, brother!
This is a suitable force.
A seriously disproportionate number of quotes, memes, soundbites, models, and plenty more have come exclusively from Dawn of War. It is, whether anyone realizes it or not, the most consequential Warhammer game there is. Unfortunately, memes have this habit of coloring perception of things, whether the memes are actually true, and Warhammer is no exception. Modern Warhammer memes are a collage of jokes or references that are either overplayed or otherwise just inaccurate. Similar to the way history memes have this habit of being believed because they're funny, and not because they're true. Dawn of War memes, though, have their start long before modern meme culture developed, which means that jokes and references were just that, jokes and references made possible by the game's already silly undertones. See, when you talk about Warhammer now, it comes with this sort of, well, this baggage. You can't enjoy a Warhammer story or game without it fitting into some grander overarching story, or getting some big lore dump video, Vati Vidya style. Dawn of War came out when Warhammer wasn't that big a thing for people. There weren't 1,000 lore videos, games, 8 billion novels, and audio dramas. You had a handful of niche games, the tabletop codexes and models, and a number of the earlier, much better novels or stories. Much better novels or stories. Dawn of War was the bridge. It created the modern Warhammer community, no matter how much people ascribe it to, well, anything else. It's not Henry Cavill's Custodes, it wasn't Astartes, it wasn't Space Marine. Those were all just stepping stones to where it is now. It was Dawn of War that hit everyone the hardest. The strategy genre got enamored with Warhammer because it had a good game to play, one that I hold up as some of the best I've ever seen. Maybe it was because I enjoyed strategy games for years and simply found a new one to play. Maybe it was because I was an impressionable kid at the time when I played it. Or maybe there's just something about Dawn of War.
What a sorry state we're in.
Too late, heretic!